Hey, Theology and Tears, those of us like a spirituality with a twist. So we have been doing a series on one of the ideas that comes from this psychologist, Wilhelm Reich, called the emotional plague. And it's part of what we've been doing a lot of in 2025, which is the what the hell is up with America theme of the year, trying to figure that out. And we've been talking about that in different ways, just trying to give different perspectives on how to think about this stuff. And then specifically, this episode is going to be a little bit more of a fleshing out of the emotional plague. Ultimately, we're going to do a little mashup with our TCM ideas, and we were alluding that in our last podcast, if you happen to be following along. But I talked with Daniel about it, and he was very magnanimous about doing this a little bit more about the emotional plague overall, especially given the time in which we're recording this in September of 2025. We don't like to do news of the week episodes, but I thought it was an interesting thing. Just like I had my own experiences of like thinking about emotional plague over the last few weeks. So I thought I would just throw it at Daniel, and this would be our deeper exploration of the emotional plague, and we'll see how it goes.
Hmm.
But before we get into the details, I'm doing the same thing that everyone always asks you to do, which is to like and subscribe, maybe write a review, maybe shoot an episode off to a friend. It's again, as people always keep saying, it really helps out with the emotional plague of the algorithm. So, I wanted to do this, Daniel, because the last few weeks in America have been so odd. And I'm not really doing it again, like I said, as a news of the week, but I had kind of like, I just thought we couldn't have come up with a better time to start talking about this idea of emotional plague from Reich, because it was a pretty like wild experience for me personally. So I'm just going to share my own sort of sense of like the last few weeks in America, and I'm curious what your sense of that was. Uh, and I thought, I just kept thinking about our episode and like, wow, emotional plague. And it became sort of like one of the core things for me that was like my filter of looking at the events. So we didn't record last week, but we recorded a couple of weeks ago. And since that time we recorded, we had it was a bigger deal for me, but we had the Shipocalypse Now thing that was going on, where our particular El Presidente had sent out this meme that depicted him as Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now. And the text was Chicago, uh, about to find out why it's called the Department of War in like all caps. And I was thinking, emotional plague. Yes, just toxic, right? And again, Reich's idea is that, and we'll go into deeper things about this, but this idea of like things go toxic in a society or a culture. And I was like, that's really toxic. And I actually have like a friend of the show, Justin Key, who's been on here in the past, and law degree, maybe not practicing lawyer now. And I was like, well, that's kind of like a threat, isn't it? Like if your neighbor sent you that, wouldn't you like send it over to the local police? And he was like, interesting question. And maybe. So we had that went on. That was part of my experience of the last few weeks. And then the US started bombing Venezuelan boats. So that happened. And our vice president, when it was pointed out that these are war crimes, replied by saying, I don't give a shit what you call it. So that happened. And I was thinking, emotional plague. And then we went into the next week and we had what's like rattling the country, which is the murder of political activists, right-wing political activist and provocateur, Charlie Kirk. No one wants to see anyone hurt, obviously. Uh, I was just thinking like, homie didn't deserve to die. And we can say homie because he's literally grew up like within like a 45-minute drive of where I am right now. So that kind of violence happening. And then this then triggering all of these cries of like war. It's war. And now people potentially being prosecuted for things that they said. So attacks on free speech. And then ultimately like talking with friends about whoever the details of this murderer are, which seems to be kind of an insane 22-year-old kid in a culture where a lot of 22-year-old kids seem to be a subculture of kids losing it and like devolving into horrific violence. And then there was another school shooting like the same afternoon. So I was like looking at all of that. Uh, I know what my experience, like, after doing our episode was like, oh, emotional plague. And yeah, it was sort of a theme that carried me through, like, since we did our last recording. And I'll throw it out to you, Daniel. I don't know, what was your
We'll just
reaction over
give a
the
little
last couple of
background
weeks?
on emotional plague in case people haven't heard, because most of the audience is always new, right?
Yeah, so emotional plague comes from this psychologist named Wilhelm Reich, who was in this circle of people who were kind of powerful psychological figures around Sigmund Freud, but like a lot of them just kind of branch out and go their own direction. So Carl Jung very famously did this, as one of the other psychologists we love on the show, when we like Wilhelm Reich. And the emotional plague has to do with this idea that you can get toxicities within a culture, and it's kind of a way of framing it like a medical model, almost like it's a contagion. So I think that use of the word plague is really powerful, and it like spreads throughout a culture or a society. And then that society goes
Mhm.
toxic. And all of a sudden, you'll see a lot of psychopathology that just spreads through all kinds of layers of that culture. Since we did the last episode, I kind of went back to one of, Reich's books on this. I've read a lot of him. He's kind of an interesting person to read because some of the stuff you're like, "Mm, I don't know about that." But other parts you're like, oh, that's a really powerful idea. So he's a little bit like that when you read him. But he has this book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And I want to talk about that one. So we'll dig more into how he thinks this emotional plague things works. But it's kind of framing toxicity in a culture in sort of a medical model having to do with like contagious, toxic things that spread out through the culture. And then the culture becomes kind of diseased. So, anyways, that's a kind of a rough and ready explanation of it.
Hmm.
What was it like for you? Were you thinking about emotional plague over the last few weeks? Or did you have that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always there's layers to things, right? So you have the external layer of reality that is occurring, a shared kind of communal experience where, these things are happening on a larger national level, if you will, happening at different places at different times, but because they're so well broadcast that they have an effect on people's lives, whether they want to be or not, for those who are engaged in that way, anyways. So you have this as a stressor in the background, especially if you're around people again who are plugged in that way. They're definitely drawn into it and want to have conversations around it and want to share thoughts. And then if you have sort of emotional investment, then you probably have feelings and thoughts on things. So there's that on one hand. And then of course we all have our own lives. And you had other things happen that we won't, talk about on air with the family and stuff like this.
That family illness happened.
Yeah,
Hmm.
family illness, fortunately, thankfully everything, resolved and is, at least manageable and good. So we have this happening too, right? And so people who are, listening or myself, we're balancing. You have the external life and then you have your internal life. And for a lot of people, I think now the internal life is very stressful. And in part because the outside life is stressful. Economics are changing and, things like this. So it's just people are online a lot more than before. It's, relatively cheap. You have to have basically a phone you know
Hmm.
and everything comes from that thing. It's like your own personal television, and then the algorithm that gets tailored to your preferences, and then it feeds you what you want to see and hear or what you don't want to see and hear, but you're pissed off either way, at something or upset, in one way or another. But then you have to deal with your own life stressors, family illness or, relationship trauma, work things, financial instability, whatever the case is, emotional stuff. And so this has to be balanced. And I think, for myself, it's been a very, tumultuous kind of couple weeks in that everything seems to be very charged. Everything seems to
Hmm.
be charged. Now, could that be because that's part of the outside charging everything and making the inside charge as well? Sure. But I seem to be having a similar discussion with people around their people who they surround themselves with and the environment that gets created when they surround themselves with those people and questioning on whether or not it's worth it to surround themselves with those people. And sometimes that question is they're questioning their family, they're questioning their friends, they're questioning the relationships with their in-laws, with colleagues, and they find it to be very acrimonious and asking, is it worth it? Is it worth it to have these relationships? And I think I have been wrestling with this now for the last, I don't know, 12 months or so. Is it
Mhm.
worth it? Are these relationships worth it? And I think about there's an author that I've read a few of his books over in the last year, with Ken McLeod. He's
Oh, yeah.
right,
Mhm.
and so he's written a couple really great. I recommend his books. We should try to have him on. He's a really good dude. Um, and he talks about when people find themselves further down the kind of spiritual path that naturally their group of friends will shift and change, and to not try to change it back, to just be accepting that these are the people that are going to nourish the next phases of your growth. You don't know who they
Mhm.
are, where they're coming from, but the places that you'll find yourself are going to be in more in alignment where you're going. And so you allow for those people to go as they go or grow with you or not, whatever. And then when you're in a new space, you'll find people who are more meeting you with where you are in line. Now, with in line with where you're going. For me, I find that a little bit of a hard pill to swallow. I'm a loyal person. I love long-standing relationships. There's a familiarity, a beauty, if I can use a euphemism, in these kind of relationships where people have seen you grow, where they know you well, and you can have conversations not with with innuendo that you guys have,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
stories that they carry, things that they've known, they've watched you through some trials and tribulations. On the other side of that coin, you're fixed. Your identity for them is fixed, relatively speaking, or fundamentally speaking, and that, oh, you're Eric. That's Eric. In the clinic, it's Dr. Baker. And in the
Mhm.
classroom, it's professor. But for your buddies or whoever, your family members or whatever, they're like, "Oh, that's Big E." We go way back.
Easy.
Easy dog. We used to eat sour cream and cheddar, chips in the back of the school bus or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And so but it's a delicate balance, and this is kind of like what I've been as I'm going through, and as we all are going through, what's been happening in people's lives and in the larger collective life of a society. It's what do I want to surround myself with? And that's the kind of as we go through stuff, this is what's been coming up for me. And as I look at society's reaction to things, and then we've said many times, or at least I've said many times, society is just a larger version of our own group, right? And then I look at my own group and say, is this what I want to be around, or is this the kind of reaction that I want to subject myself to in terms of my friends and family or whoever who I keep near me? Is this worth it? Because I don't want to prune people because I don't agree with them or I don't share the same views or whatever. I think that that can also be very toxic as well because then now you're not exposing yourself to other ideas, and then now we're one step away from joining a cult. You know what I'm saying? Oh, these people all agree with me. They must be great because I'm right, of course. And so they're right because they agree with, so that doesn't do well either. So I'm just trying to find that the line between those things. And it's not a very clearly delineated one from my perspective.
This is awesome because we both are kind of just talking from the heart. I think we both are, right? And it does wrap around to part of what I was like kind of thinking about with this emotional plague stuff, because there's a kind of a very personal model within that too. And then there's a way of talking about kind of collective. And it does hit on what you're talking about. I know what you're going to think about, kind of maybe what Reich has to say about some of those issues, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah.
But it is a medical model. And part of what he says is that there's always a kind of an undercurrent of like a kind of insanity within a society.
Mm,
There's always a bit of crazy going on. And his argument with that goes, and I'm maybe more, I don't even know, Daniel, I might be a little bit more of a radical believer in this than you are, but we can kick it around, where he's like, there's this kind of things that you find in Taoism and in Tantra and so on, where you have the society always kind of a little crazy, always trying to stifle the individual person and their spiritual development.
mm,
And that has to be transcended in some way, in the sense that they kind of disturb the natural sort of expression and evolution of the individual can get kind of smushed. So this is sort of like the chronic problem of emotional plague. And he's kind of hardcore on that. And I do believe that in some level. When I was going back and looking at this Mass Psychology of Fascism book again, again, one of the rarer books I didn't read from him. I read a bunch back in the day.
mm-hmm.
And I'll throw the theory out and you can see what you think. And then I think it does apply to like how we surround ourselves with people too, because he's has something kind of powerful to say about that. And
Hmm.
we'll get your feedback on it. So he kind of says that the core of human nature is good.
I would
And I
agree.
think there's a kind of a Taoist or Buddhist vibe. Sometimes you call that Buddha nature. Sometimes you call that the original Shen. There's a kind of a core thing. And we mentioned it in different episodes when this has come up with him. In the Advanced Psychology of Fascism, he says, well, people want to love, people want to learn and gather knowledge, and people want to be involved in creative, productive activity. That's the core of human nature. And I like that idea, right?
Mm.
So very positive kind of values. And he's like the way he kind of frames his model, and this is something that maybe each of us can try to maybe visualize. Like, you can almost imagine like that's the core of the thing, and there's going to be
Hmm.
these outer layers kind of surrounding,
Like an onion.
like an onion. So much of life is like an onion.
Makes you cry.
Uh, yes. And then it feels spicy when you eat it. Um, so so then what he says is like, and he does pin this. Some of these things can be based on like personal traumas, but a lot of this has to do with like his idea of the emotional plague overall. And what I find striking about it was like you have these kind of good sort of instinctive drives within people, and they get distorted by external conditions and kind of and in the distortion, they become kind of toxic. So this is kind of an interesting take, you know? You can have natural instincts for love and knowledge and creativity, and those things get stifled or they get kind of distorted. And then those energies that want to express itself in these positive ways kind of go chaotic or go toxic. And you get this layer inside the person that has all of this conflict and all of this potential toxic emotionality around it. Like he talks that way,
Mm.
you know? So I think that's a very interesting idea. It probably has some overlap with like Buddhist ideas of like ego or something like that too, where you get all these distorted kind of things going on.
Mm. Mm.
He doesn't reference anything that's, Asian culture at all, but he does talk that way. And I thought, okay, so that's a model he's building up, right? The core is positive. And then there's another layer he's proposing that this kind of goes distorted and toxic because the energies get, again, distorted. It's an interesting way of framing energy, right? The energies can't go to their natural conclusions. So they get all this like diverted and just like distorted again, to use that word, or like misdirected. And all of a sudden they become internal pathology within people. And this seems to be his experience of like working with people. You know,
Well,
you Mhm.
I have been, if people are paying attention to what's been happening, I think in general over the last, this year basically, if you want to have conversations around and get people's thoughts and share your own, I've been asking people before we engage in a conversation, there has to be some clear understandings on what we think about human beings. And
Mhm.
the couple questions I ask are three. One, do you believe that everybody is good at heart? That their core is good? Do you believe this? And number two, do you believe that everybody is an equal?
Mhm.
And then number three, do you believe that everybody deserves, you know, life, liberty, the health, the pursuit of happiness? Do you believe that everybody has the same rights as a being? Because you could say everybody's equal, but these people deserve more. You know what I'm saying?
Or
So,
like, yeah, or like rights to love, knowledge, creative. You could frame it even in that
yeah,
way if you want to
yeah,
tap into like the core positivities,
yeah,
however you want to
sure.
do it. Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
But those three things, if the answer is yes to those three things, then we can have a civil discourse and agree on how we're going to come to conclusions or agreeing to disagree, or we're looking at a problem from a different perspective, but ultimately we're trying to come to a conclusion that will be beneficial for a group or hopefully the larger group, but at least some people within this group. But if the answer to those other questions is no, that you don't believe that people are good at heart, or only some are. I said all people. It has to be all or none. This is one of the few times that I'll do that, right? And you
Hmm.
don't believe that all people are equal, and that you don't believe that people have a basic right to pursue love and wisdom and health and happiness and
Hmm.
all this other kind of stuff, right? If you don't believe in those things, they're kind of, I don't know, for me, and I don't want to put walls up, but there's not, we're already off. We're already looking at things because I can't really engage in an intellectual or even forget intellectuality in a heart-centered discussion on humanity and human beings' existence because we don't hold human beings' existence in the same light. There's the chosen ones and then there's the trash. And
Mm.
I don't believe that. So I may not agree with you, but because I think the way that I do and I feel the way that I do, I believe that you, this invisible argument person, has the same rights to life, liberty, happiness, wisdom, everything else that I do. I believe that we both have the same core, and I believe that we are both equals. We just see things differently. Other than that, though, I'm not really going to be able to discuss policy or ideas on how to fix problems because we're not looking to fix the same problem in a different way. You're looking to do something else that is not part of this discussion.
Yeah, it's interesting because it like frames like some ground of conversation that you have to have
Yeah.
as a place just to start. If we can't
Hmm.
agree on these fundamental things,
Correct.
but if we can get on the same page of these fundamental things, hey, maybe we do have an opportunity to go
Yeah.
further and
Yeah.
flesh this out. Those are like obviously very deep questions to ask people. I don't want to put you on the spot to share anything
Go ahead.
too personal with who you talk to about it, but how have people responded when you ask them that kind of stuff?
So
Obviously, it's
far,
people in your own circle, so I mean, you
people in
know
my
who you're
own
talking about.
circle,
Yeah.
yeah, so far fine. I only ask, and here's the thing, I only ask them when I question if they believe it. People who I know,
Okay.
I probably don't ask because I already kind of know.
Just a full confession. Daniel hasn't asked me these questions yet.
I have not asked you these questions yet.
The
No.
answer will be yes.
Hmm.
Three yeses.
So I generally ask them for people who I believe very differently from.
You're trying to establish grounds
I'm
with them.
trying to
Hey, let's
establish,
find
yeah.
some common ground that we
Let's
can
find
work
some
out of.
common ground. Yeah, we can still disagree. I mean, human beings like to resonate close together. It's just a natural tendency of talking in person, which is why when you're doing things online, you have this level of disassociation from the other person's energy, and you can totally argue with them with on everything because there's the natural tendency to try and find commonality is gone. And then by the time you might see them in person, you've already demonized or vilified them to be something that is, worth, demonizing or worth injuring or worth, not worth talking to as a normal human being that you would see if you met in the street.
You also get the Key and Peele effect in my mind. They have that bit where the two dudes are texting each other
Yeah,
and
yeah,
everything goes off the rails.
yeah,
And who is it? Jordan Peele, right? And he's kind of like just high and playing video games and everything's cool with him. And the other guy is getting more and more mad
yes,
because he thinks he's mistreating him in these texts. He's getting more and more pissed off. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a search.
it's great. Yeah.
By the end, they're meeting up in the bar, and the one guy's bringing in a baseball bat full of nails. He's going to clobber the guy with it. And his buddy's like, hey,
Yeah.
know? I won't ruin the end of the bit because it's funny. I don't
Yeah.
want to, no spoilers beyond
That's,
that, but
yeah.
it's funny to watch, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it does capture, like, you can write things that you'd never be able to say to somebody's face. You
Hmm.
just wouldn't be able to do it. It'd be
Hmm.
so toxic, obviously toxic.
Also, you might get
Yeah.
punched before you get that far anyways. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
I think like the emotional plague part of it then is like I think Reich would say something like if you can't come to an agreement, and those are three powerful questions. If you can't come to that, then I think he's going to start diagnosing it. We can agree or disagree on that, but I think he's going to start saying, okay, if you can't come to those fundamental principle ideas and say, okay, yeah, I'm in, then there's some kind of emotional plague operative. Because again, it's kind of a way of medicalizing this for what it's worth. And then he would say, yeah, it's part of something that's gone wrong. And maybe this is a comfortable spot for us to be in, Daniel, because I do feel, with all the funky shit that's happened in the bigger spirit things in the last few weeks, I feel much more comfortable talking about it in a clinical way because we're clinicians and I find it to be helpful, you know? So let's clinicalize this, and say, okay, well, without even really, it's an optimistic model in what would seem like a pessimistic thing.
Yes.
You start saying emotional plague, everyone's like, oh man, that sounds really pessimistic, but he's not pessimistic at the core. And in a certain sense, it's optimistic because you can say, well, if we can get past or start to sort out these aspects of EP, emotional plague, then we can get to a place where probably at the core we can come to a much more compassionate, loving, accepting part of like human nature. But it's
Mm,
this shit in the middle. Then he has
hmm
one other piece that he adds. And again, this is kind of based on his clinical experience. And, he was a clinician, like we're clinicians, maybe, we can all maybe get, if you're not a clinician, you get in a clinical mindset and thinking about this because he was working one-on-one with people. And as he started to kind of like explore what he thought felt was going on in the human psyche. And then we'll also talk about future episodes, how this affects the body. We referenced that last episode. We'll get back to it. But
hmm
the idea that then there's a kind of an outer facade that gets formed around people. And
mm,
it's interesting the way he talks about it, because in some ways it's a little bit like I still have to function in the world. I have all these sort of like inner anxieties and angers and bitternesses that are part of this emotional plague part. And at the core, there's a much more positive part. So it's like a three-part onion. And the outer layer is more like, okay, I might have what would look like a kind of a nicer persona or something, right? But maybe in my private moments, I go home and I'm super angry online and I'm like swearing at people and saying all kinds of toxic shit and it just pours out, but I go to work the next day and I'm like, that's put on the shelf for that time or that's suppressed on some level and I function throughout the day. And then, given the right circumstances, all this stuff will get a chance to vent itself out.
mm,
And it fits into that online thing. People get that moment like now the emotional plague is going to finally come out because I was like, nice the whole day or something, right?
mm.
That's an interesting kind of take. I thought, oh, that's an interesting way to think about human beings.
Yeah.
Uh, you can do whatever you want with this. We're all trying to learn by looking at these thinkers. That's part of what we try to do on the pod. But I was like, that's interesting, you know, and people will have this outer layer that seems much more socialized on some level that they can like interact with others. And then there's this more toxic part. So I found that to be really interesting to think about over the last couple of weeks since we did the other episode, because I was like, yeah, that's an interesting model. You get the outer core, you get the inner core, the facade on the outside, you get the inner core, which is full of all this positive energy that then all that energy, again, like we were talking about before, gets distorted and takes on this sort of toxicity. But if you can straighten it out or get through it, then you can get back to something much more positive at the root. So I'm
Mm,
really attracted to the idea. I like it. You
mm,
know, he does frame it as sort of like a chronic problem. And as I was medicalizing this for myself, I was like, well, this is sort of the chronic illness of things, right? This is sort of a perpetual problem, that you have to work through if you're trying to sort yourself out as a person. And that's a very individual level. I think for what you were talking about earlier, and I don't know what I think totally about this, but he takes a hardcore position in towards part of this, which we may not agree with. But part of his position is if you are trying to straighten yourself out, when you get around other people who are emotional plaguey, it fucks with you. So he does say that, it'll be hard for you to like if you are straightening this out, it'll be hard to be around other people who are kind of emotional plaguey, or maybe that'll be harder in the beginning. So I know what you think about that, but he kind of says he almost frames it like because it's like a contagion, you'll get like reinfected or something. So it's a hard line position. I don't know if I agree with it, but I'm throwing it out there.
Yeah, I feel like that's resonance, right? And that's I talked about this just a little bit ago in terms of people are keeping people around, and checking that, being critical a little bit about your relationships and deciding on who and how you want to have people around you and what they do to you, right, on based on their reactions. If so where I would agree is that like if you're not fully settled into your current beliefs, because our beliefs are changing. I mean, some things are tenets, they're there forever basically. And some things are, we're searching still. I feel like it's, there's like a sieve and the things that get through stay at the bottom. They're there. Other things they keep getting filtered. They keep getting filtered as they should be.
Mhm.
If you're still in the deep filtration process and not a lot of things have made it through the sieve to the bottom to really be solidified, yes, you're going to be knocked off your rocker much more easily, as one would expect. However, if you are, I don't want to say ingrained because it seems maybe cultish, but like if you are grounded in what it is that you believe, if you've worked through it, if you've seen it in practice, or if you've lived it long enough that you have seen the positive effects that whatever you're doing or believing have on your life, then other people who don't share those beliefs or even share contrary beliefs doesn't phase you. You can hold two disparate ideas simultaneously and not be broken by that, you know? Because it's not so much that it's changing you in what you think, it's just it brings up a challenge and maybe you can find some merit in what someone's saying, but ultimately it's not changing the gold that you have found in the things that have brought you peace and harmony in your life, because that is not it's not giving that to them, or at least you don't believe that to be the case. Because if it was, then this conversation will look entirely different.
Well, it's kind of like a bodhisattva thing too, because you can go out into an area and still hold your own energy, and like then you're trying to. I mean, this is true. What people will say about this in a kind of a Buddhist tantric world or Taoist world or whatever world we're
Mm,
in, that that person who's Kabbalistic, Sufic, whatever, Sufi world, that person's able to hold this space of a kind of a positivity,
mm-hmm.
even though there may be negative things going around them.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes what might be useful for this kind of thing is, and it sounds harsh and potentially judgmental, but sometimes you can just say, oh, well, that's an emotional plague thing going on with this person. And it's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of a harsher thing to think or say,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe what I found to be a little bit, I'm not talking about at an individual level now, I'll get to the social level in a second, but sometimes that's just helpful to do,
Mm-hmm.
just to be able to say, oh, there's a toxicity going on in this particular relationship or this particular group of people. This has gone emotional plague. And okay, and you can just feel comfortable saying, okay, that's what it is. And that's the reason I'm having conflict in this situation. And all right, that's my diagnosis if we're being clinical.
Mm,
And sometimes it like takes the tension and the complexity out of things and just
mm,
like go, okay, all right. This person's having like this is what Reich would do. Oh, this person's having an attack of the emotional plague. That's fine. All right, they're going through an attack of the emotional plague, and we'll try to do what we can. This will calm down, and we'll be able to interact again or something.
mm.
So he would
Well,
talk that way, like it would be an illness that would flare in people, and they could go that way.
let me
A little
run.
harsh, but clinically kind of interesting, and sometimes like, psychologically helpful. Sorry, yeah.
No, you're good. Let me run this analogy by you. So the way that I think about this, and I have thought about this, and I've talked about this before at various teachings and whatnot that I have done, that we have done, is that if you have a couple, let's say tuning forks. And I hope people know what tuning forks are, but let's hope that they understand what those are. And if you whack one and you put it next to another one, the other tuning fork will start to vibrate because the vibrations from the first tuning fork will affect the second tuning fork. Well, if we imagine ourselves as tuning forks when we are in community with other people, they're all tuning forks. Everybody's affecting each other, right? And this
Yeah,
kind of like cohesive effect in a negative sense is the emotional plague, right?
yeah.
And so if you think of somebody who is unaffected by this plague, if you will, their tuning fork is not really affected by the other ones. And this is kind of like, the bodhisattva, or we'll say a saint or something like this, or just a good person in general. From my understanding, it's not that they are protecting their tuning fork. They're not guarding their own personal resonance, because that would take too much energy and they would probably not be able to function. If you imagine hundreds of thousands of tuning forks in Times Square and maybe one or two that were unaffected from all of the other, sounds and tunes from the other forks, it would require so much energy. You'd have to be on guard all the time. You'd be like an egg that eventually something would crush you, and now all your energy would have been built up, you know, in order to protect yourself, and there would be not much to protect on the inside because you'd be just doing more protecting than cultivating, you know.
Mhm.
That I have found, and I think my understanding is right. We'll see what you think. Um, that it's not about protecting that resonance. It's actually about deeply letting it go, and that realizing that everything is connected and everything is resonating, but not at the frequency that we believe that we're resonating on. There is a much larger unified resonance that occurs through all things. And these, as we like to say, temporary localized phenomenon resonate and dissipate like anything and everything else because everything is impermanent. And so you don't have to necessarily, protect or guard or, try to keep all the kind of like darkness away. It's that you're not there as you believe yourself to be. Yes, on one hand, you're a tuning fork for sure. But on the other hand, you're totally fucking not. And your resonance is actually, in my opinion, not touched, not deeply touched anyways, by the rest of these people's frequencies and resonances that they're sharing with you because you're not attached to it. You're operating independently. Even though you're still totally connected, you're also independent. I know that these things that this idea or these ideas are they're juxtaposed to each other and there's some maybe amount of like cognitive dissonance that exists within there, but that level of understanding, that challenge on making those things that seem dissonant and opposite are for me what I believe is just layers of ignorance and within myself and in the ability to explain that at this particular time in my understanding. So with that as the preamble,
Just as a like a little bit a thing, we have this bit in the pod that occasion comes up called the shower curtain of wisdom,
mm,
which is a shower curtain in the bathroom across this all over here. And one of the quotes is from one of our favorite people, Robert Thurman, Bobby T. Has been a guest on our podcast a couple of times. You can check out the episodes, Uma's dad. And he says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but something like enlightenment is the ability to transcend cognitive dissonance or something like
oh
that.
wow, okay.
So, anyways, it's on the little shower curtain over there. I have all these
Mm,
quotes from sort of like great people like Robert Thurman is given to me as a gift. Anyways, yeah, I hear it. And, there's a martial arts way of thinking about this, maybe, which is like I can put up shields.
mm-hmm,
But there's another way of doing it. And I think for me, it came from one of my traditional Chinese medicine mentors and Taoist mentors, Master Shengli Wang, Dr. Wang, who I studied with back when I was getting my TCM, traditional Chinese medicine training and degree in grad school. And he did it differently. It was a little bit more what you're talking about because you're interconnected with this great sea of energy. You're part of the great sea of energy. It's not just your energy, you're
mm-hmm,
tapped into all of this. And if you can get into that space, then what is happening with other people isn't that powerful. If you feel like you're connected to the ocean, some little wave over here or there isn't going to be as disturbing to you,
mm-hmm,
because you're like an ocean, right?
mm-hmm.
And uh, and that kind of affected me a lot. And I think I used to worry about that kind of stuff. Do I have to shield myself?
Mm-hmm.
And you can do shielding things. I mean, you can do
Sure.
them and they work and they're cool. And there's Buddhist Tantra versions of shielding and so on. But, in a lot of the more powerful stuff, Tibetan things and Taoist things and so on, it's this connection to this bigger field of energy.
Mm-hmm,
And then it's not just your little resonance having to
mm-hmm,
compete with the resonance against other people who will be resonating other ways. You're part
mm-hmm,
of a big sea of resonance.
mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I have felt about those things.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess I'll go like so in Reich's thing, and I agree with that. There's kind of a chronic illness of emotional plague, and I, again can be a little bit more radical on that. We can all decide where we want to be on a continuum of how we would think about this. But I tend to think a lot of stuff is emotional plague. It's a big theme in the podcast, and like get away from it. You want to change your life, get away from emotional plague. And that fits in the Reichian model. You want to get to that core thing, jettison the emotional plague. And then you'll find yourself much easier to get to these things that are the loving and the knowledge and the creative, like productive activity. I love that model. I think it's awesome. And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like bases on the idea that there's something chronic. If we use the infectious disease thing, what hit me as I was thinking about it is that sometimes this emotional plague goes like acute, and that can happen in an individual. They can flare, right? Like someone who has like a risk of something flaring, a chronic illness or something, or this might happen like in a social sense, and he does try to address this question. Sometimes you can get things going toxic all over the place within a culture or within a society. And I thought, well, that in a weird way, all of this stuff felt very comforting to me, even though things have been very chaotic over the last few weeks, and I kind of shared my experience of it. So, and I kind of thought, well, it's a little bit like there's a chronic illness and then it may flare. The metaphor maybe medically, might be like someone has an autoimmune disease, and they're okay and it's a little bit they're ill and it's whatever. And then that disease may flare. And all of a sudden you see it like rupture out, right? And if you're not that medical of a person, you can imagine like maybe people who have something like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. They're okay, they're okay. Things aren't perfect, but they're in this range, and all of a sudden everything flares, and they have all these symptoms. And I thought, okay, that's kind of what we're going through. We're going through like a flaring of, the chronic has exploded into something acute, and we're just like kind of in the thrall of that for a little bit. There's this insidious thing that we may all have to deal with, and then suddenly that autoimmune disease goes acute and toxic, and then all of a sudden you have this acute flaring. And I thought, okay, that kind of fits as a medical model for me too.
Mm,
We're in the midst of sort of like a flaring of something kind of toxic. And again, I don't know how this feels to other people, but I found this again like oddly comforting just to like recognize that and go,
mm,
okay, this is what's happening around us. And it's kind of like through all the different layers, you might say, in the social world that we're living through now. All kinds of toxic shit is happening like everywhere. It's going really toxic, right? And it's a flaring of this emotional plague. Maybe recognizing that doesn't solve it, but it like to me it like it was a sort of a simplifying thing to realize. Maybe the simplicity of it kind of appealed to me. I don't know what you think, Daniel, but I was like, okay, I get it. Whether it's something that's happening on a big governmental level or things that are happening within other parts. Okay, we're in the midst of like a flaring of the emotional plague. It's not good, you know, it's not good, but at least I can kind of frame and say, okay, that's what it is. And there's again something in the simplicity of that. Maybe it is medical too, and maybe it's like being medical thinkers. You get a whole bunch of symptoms in someone, and you're like, what the fuck is happening? Why are all these symptoms flaring? And you say,
mm,
oh, it's that. Okay, at least now we have a place to start.
mm-hmm,
That's what it is. You
mm-hmm.
know, like someone who has, I mean, I guess lupus is one of the good examples of this if we're going to go fully medical. You might have all kinds of crazy symptoms. And, we've all talked to patients like you and I both talked to patients who have this, maybe other people, someone who's gone through something, medical mystery, what's going on. They go in and eventually someone says, it's this. And at least you have a place to start, and it simplifies things out. I know, does that resonate with you all at all, Daniel? It was helpful to me.
Yeah, no, I mean it's an opportunity to understand phenomenon that seem to be lacking description on a rational level without having this understanding. And so while this doesn't necessarily explain everything, but it does give you a bit of a understanding as to what's happening. And then, we love to, analogies help people understand. So you say, okay, society is an organism. This is an illness within that organism. The only question I have is, who is this organism's doctor? Is it God?
Yeah. Well, it's going to have to be like us as the microbes within the organism trying to fix shit.
That's what we are. We're two little macrophages just running around. Although we're skilled, so we're probably more like T cells, you know?
We're trying to be like
That's it.
this,
We're
not
trying.
killer T cells, not the T8s. We're trying to be like we wouldn't take that name on ourselves. Yeah.
We're cytokines for those
Yes.
who are familiar with molecular biology or at this point,
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I agree, and that's the gist of the show in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I get, and again, if this speaks to anybody else, I kind of like, okay, got it. Because I was listening to different people, even people that I like. Before we did the podcast, there was like, I hit on something with like Scott Galloway, Professor G, right? And I'll listen to him occasionally. He's not someone I listen to all the time,
He's
but I know
good.
you listen to him sometimes too. He's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah, he's good. Yeah,
And I was listening to him try to like explain what was going on, his impressions. And he's a smart guy, very articulate,
yeah, Professor
great.
Galloway. Yeah, what's funny
Yeah.
about him is that his newsletters and his speaking voice sound the same.
He writes like he talks.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So I was like kind of going like, okay. And I was listening to him and I was like, emotional plague. And I was listening to somebody else. Everyone's having explanations for
Yeah,
things
right.
now.
Right.
And I was like, you know what? Time out. Emotional plague, right? And then you can go through and you can say, well, the toxic parts of something like Trumpism and MAGA, those toxic things are emotional plague, and the political violence is emotional plague, and the school shootings are emotional plague. And okay, we have something going toxic in the culture, right?
Mm.
And so I maybe the simplifying of that felt kind of good,
Mm.
right? And then you can kind of spread it out and maybe even gets over both sidesism because I was like, I don't want to be a both sidesism person. I do think that there's real danger in what's happening in the political climate now. I think this
Hmm.
is a dangerous administration. I'm not going to softball that, right? But at the same time, like, the Dems tried to put up a dementia patient to run against this guy, and that's emotional plague too. It's toxic. There's something wrong, right? And I don't know if that helps us all in the end, but maybe this thing of just recognizing, okay, something's gone toxic, and maybe that's a place to start
Yeah.
and say, hey, time out. We got something going on that's kind of toxic. And maybe if we realize that more and more, then maybe we're able to like snap ourselves out of it or something, right?
That's the hope.
And stop being well overwhelmed by like the toxicity. But maybe that's a start. You go, okay, let's make a diagnosis, you know, and we'll just make it. I know it's sweeping on some level, but I
Yes.
think Reich is trying to be sweeping on some level because sometimes they just go funky ass, right?
I
And this has
I
gone
always
funky.
I always keep a broom nearby, you know?
Yeah. Yes. So things go bad. Things go bad. And you have to go, okay,
That's what it
maybe we
is.
diagnose this thing and it
Yeah.
simplifies it down. So,
Yeah.
okay.
All right,
Well, that's
brother.
our emotional plague episode.
That's it. Well, thank you as always.
Thank you,
Audience,
Daniel.
thank you for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, subscribe, share our work, do the things that people ask you to do because it's free and it helps. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, the micro C that no one likes to talk about, please feel free. Leave a comment in the YouTube section. Usually we get back to you. Unless I really don't like what you say, then my mom told me if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. So that's that. Or send us an email at ginandtantra@gmail.com or hit us up on the gram, the Gin and Tantra Podcast. For Eric, this is Daniel. We'll get you guys in the next one. Peace.